2. I'm Bill Turpie, and our guest this morning is Dr. Mwalimu Imara. He was one of the original students working with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her seminar on death and dying at the University of Chicago. And at present, he is an associate of hers and also director of the Boston Center for Religion and Psychotherapy. And Dr. Imara, a while back, Psychology Today had a brief section in which it was talking about the fact that a great number of people in mental hospitals are there because they have not dealt adequately with grief. Why is that so? What does grief do to us to put us into that sort of a state?
Well, there's been for the past several years an interest in stress, and so we're all very much concerned about stress. And one of the most stressing or distressing factors that can happen to us is the death of someone. Several people have been doing research and have found out that any change in your lifestyle, any change in your daily habits will give you stress, and this accumulated stress will then, if not dealt with or worked out, will generate disease, psychosomatic illness, and so on. Well, it's found that grief, bereavement, grief, unresolved grief, or just grief itself, the loss of someone, can generate more stress than any other single kind of episode.
Why have we refused to deal with this as a culture? It seems to me apparent that we really do not take grief seriously. People in other cultures don black and wear it for a long time. We get up in the morning and we hope that by the end of the day our grief will have passed.
Well, we can't deal with grief because we don't deal with death. After all, it was because of Dr. Ross's really radical intervention into the life of patients who had life-threatening illnesses in the hospital that brought about her fame, because this society really doesn't deal with death at all. And so if death becomes unmentionable, how much more unmentionable is the consequent feelings and hurt that comes after a loss of someone. So we don't, and because of that, we paid a price, you see. Coming out of the agrarian society and rushing very madly into this highly technological society where mobility is rampant, people move and change, we don't have stable communities anymore. And we've lost the traditions, we've lost the folkways, if you will, that naturally have helped us deal with grief. So we don't have them today. So we have to recreate them again. And the stored up problems are paying a terrible toll. I mean, some people are finding, I think Lawrence Leshane and some other researchers did a study and in '72 and found that many people who've had unresolved griefs in their life have developed cancer after X number of months, 18 months or 3 years and so on after the event.
The causation is clear.
Well, there's been so much research done on the stress causing some of these diseases, such as cancer and so on, and it seems that one of the significant stressing events in people's life who have cancer is a grief or a loss, a separation, an unresolved separation.
A divorce could be that.
A divorce could be that, yes. For example, many problems, I deal with a lot of college students, and many of the problems come about initially just because of the separation from home. The kid is perfectly healthy, perfectly adjusted, but is not ready for the impact of that initial separation from home that it brings. So separation, grief, separation always brings grief. And it's a biological reaction. This is one of the most, I guess, if you were to ask me what was the one thing you'd want to say tonight, about grief, and it's that grief is a natural reaction and it catches us unawares. The consequence of not looking at death and grief means that we can be caught totally unawares by it. For example, my introduction to the power of a grief reaction took place in a hospital corridor when a man rushed out of his brother's room and started to tear the cabinets off the wall. And my supervisor stopped them, and down in the elevator he said, "Thank you for stopping me from making a fool of myself." His brother just died, and that's his first response. And he was surprised. And I find in my practice that people come to me and say, you know, I really didn't like her very much, but why am I so torn up inside?
This might be a man speaking of his wife.
Might be a man speaking of his wife. Sometimes people, you know, we don't want to say it, but people are very happy when somebody close to them is dying. And yet, after they die, they go through this very, very powerful grief response, and they can't understand it because what they call a cognitive dissonance. What we know to be the case with our mind is contradicted by the overwhelming response in our feelings. And so therefore we say, well, obviously if I feel so bad, then they must have been a real person, a beautiful person, a wonderful person, and I'm short-sighted, and so they wallow in guilt. Or the other side, they must have been so wonderful, and so on, and so you can't say anything bad about them, and they're forever honored as heroes.
How do I know when I'm dealing adequately with my grief? How do I know that I'm dealing with it in a holistic way? I have a funeral for the person that has died in my family. Is that adequate?
No, not really. Grief is a physical, psychological response, actually. Not everyone needs to grieve. There are many reasons why someone may have someone close to them die and not really feel terrible for a period of time. But one of the important things to remember is that you're going through a basic, almost very basic, very natural thing that you can't resist.
You said one time it was a biological fact, grief.
Grief is a biological fact. For example, what is grief? What is grief resolution? What are the things you have to get out? Unlike most therapies, which tend to want you to slow you down and want you to take your time and not be overwhelmed. Unlike that, when we deal with grief, we're dealing with something else. People have to express their feelings, they have to express their meanings, they have to get some understanding of it. And in grief,
Then it was okay for that man to rip those cabinets off the wall, to express that rage.
To express that rage. It's not okay to permit him to do that because he didn't really want to do it, but to allow him to express the rage. And quite often we turn people off when they start raging. It's not polite to get angry. It's not polite to say nasty things. I just had a situation where a young man was expressing nasty things after a particular grief situation to his sisters and so on. And immediately they put him on a Haldol and Ritalin. A psychiatrist recommended that he be put on a heavy tranquilizer and something that you give to people who have very serious distortion problems, perhaps psychosis, and which is totally not warranted. This person was in extreme grief. I had a situation where a person came after reading an article in a paper about on grief, came to me and said, I just wanted to tell somebody about this. I went in to talk to a psychiatrist about grief after my mother had died, and they put me away. They actually put me in the hospital. And I said, what was your behavior? Why? And of course, she said, well, it wasn't the things I was doing, the things I was saying and of my experience. And the thing she was describing was something that happens quite often with grief. We have hallucinations, we have feelings that sometimes we're not touching the ground. We have all sorts of events that are unusual. And one of the greatest fears in grief, in an extreme grief, is that I'm losing my mind. And you see the same thing happening in divorce situations. The person feels so unlike they used to feel. And this is a response, of course, this is something that you can go through and work through. And what we do is we push it underground, and the person can't express it. So therefore, we tend to deal with it more bodily, and thus we have the colitis and the various ulcers, the various other forms of psychosomatic illness. One of which is, I think some people would agree with me, at least a couple of days ago, some medical people would agree that cancer is, they said a lot of cancer is psychogenic and it comes from a great deal of stress and probably grief.
We need to take a break at this point, and again I come back to the fact that you worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and she gives you credit at the beginning of her book on death and dying, which was the seminal work in this area.
Yes.
And for strong appreciation for the help that you provided her, and you recently helped her finish up a book called Death, the Final Stage of Growth.
That's right.
Is that it? And when we come back, we want to talk about how that could possibly be so. We'll be back in just a moment on Genesis 2. Stay with us. In Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work with dying patients, she noted that there are 5 stages that a person goes through in their movement toward their own death. Moving from the stability of health to that point when an illness is diagnosed as terminal, one passes into the first stage of denial or shock. In this stage, there is the experience of loneliness and meaninglessness, until these erupt in a second stage, which is that of anger, an emotional stage with resentment and bitterness expressed. A third stage begins to emerge, which can be called bargaining. I'll do this if you'll just get me out of this, God or doctor. In this stage, there is a gradual realization of the consequences, the real consequences of death. The fourth stage is that of preparatory depression, and then a movement upward begins toward increased self-awareness and contact with others, to a fifth and final stage of acceptance, a stage with increased self-reliance. And Dr. Imara, it's that stage of acceptance. The question I have is, does everyone move to that fifth point, that fifth stage in their movement toward their own death?
No.
That's disappointing.
No. Everyone could, but not everyone does. We tend to die the way we lived. And quite a few of us live our lives denying the reality, denying the contact, denying the relationships we have all around us. Many of us live relationships which are very poor. Many of us live very alienated lives, feeling as though we don't belong where we are, wherever we are. And if we get a terminal illness, or we get an illness that is life-threatening, because there are very few illnesses that are really terminal, we will live out that lifestyle we've been living. Many people live full lives, make close relationships and so on, and then there are certain kinds of people, these kinds of people who are outgoing, more inclusive, people who feel that they have some control over their lives, people who get some sense of meaning from life. These are the people who tend to spontaneously move through those 5 stages, and will go right through them, sometimes very rapidly, as a matter of fact.
Can a person be helped to move through those stages?
Definitely. Definitely.
What does it take to move through those 5 stages? To come to that point of acceptance.
To have somebody who listens. One of the reasons why we got into this work so intensely is after we started looking, the proposals were made to Dr. Ross to be a guide to us as we talked to dying patients. But then we found that everyone resisted death and so on.
I heard her once say that she went into the hospital and on none of the floors that she talked with the head nurse or one of the doctors there, nobody would admit that they had a dying patient.
No one would admit, and people would die alone. People would run. But more profoundly and perhaps more tragically, friends. If you say you had a cancer today, right today, your friends, you would suddenly find that your friends wouldn't want to meet you in the hallway or right out here in the studio. They would cut you. Well-meaning people, but there's something that happens when a member of our family or a friend of ours suddenly is stricken, and it seems we feel it's contagious, and so we cut them and we leave them. And a person is lost. Well, what happens to a person who has never been able to reach out anyway? They become more and more isolated. But the person that's been able to reach out, there are certain people who are able to get what they want from their environment, and particularly get what they want in terms of human relationships. These people tend to go through all of those stages. And when we find people who are alone and alienated, sometimes if they've lived a whole lifestyle in that way, that if we come and we reach out to them and we say, hey, you're important to us. Yes, you know, you may have cancer. Yes, this may be your second coronary. Yes, you may have diabetes and you're going blind, and you know what that means. It may be, you know, that life is short unless your treatment takes. But nevertheless, we're going to stay with you, because most people run away from anybody who has a life-threatening illness. And when you start doing that and you listen, start to listen. What has your life meant to you? What does life mean now? Because certainly you may have many years in front of you with the cancer. You may even get cured of the cancer. But nevertheless, having had that fright, life today is much different than what it was yesterday before you had the diagnosis.
So there's a sense in which those who are surrounding us can either make us sick or well in terms of how we face that dying experience.
Precisely.
Their rejection of us can cause us to reject our own death.
That's right. And then we don't go through those stages, and we don't go through what is naturally the self-grieving process, and we die in conflict, torment, or depression. I've seen many people just end up in that very depressed, very, very depressed state and die. And some people live a lifestyle of being not so much loners, but being just life rejectors. And when they die that way. They tend to die rejecting.
Now you talked about the fact, and I've heard this before, that we die like we live.
That's right.
In other words, the pattern of our dying is not different from the pattern of our living. Does that mean that if we are people who as we deal with grief along the way, well, let me put it this way, to deal with somebody else's death is to also deal with my death?
Precise, yes, exactly. You see, along with, if a good friend of yours, a very close friend of yours died, when a very close friend of mine is quite ill at the present time, well, I don't want to talk about it, I get very much emotionally caught into it, but his illness is a part of my life. I mean, it is something I must adjust to, I must feel, I must express, I cry about, or worry about, or feel about. And when I get into difficult situations, it's all those griefs that I've had, the pains I've had, the friends I've lost, that come into the working of my own death or my own serious illness whenever it should occur. So
to avoid the dying of those who are around us and those who have been close to us is to, in reality, avoid our own dying.
Avoid our own dying.
And thus not prepare ourselves for our own death. There's another thing that occurs to me, and that is this statement in Dr. Ross's most recent book, "Death, the Final Stage of Growth." How could that be? I mean, death is termination.
Well, actually, the book was named after a quote of mine. I said, my chapter was to be "Death, is the final stage of growth," and I quoted that in the seminar once. And Dr. Ross said, "That's what I want the book title to be." And it came because there were several patients or people we were working with, and we've seen this from the very beginning. You'd be working with somebody who realistically, their prognosis could not possibly be over 2 or 3 more months. They were just so badly damaged by their illness, either burn or cancer or many illnesses. And you would work with them, and they'd be hopeless and despairing, and they'd live maybe very difficult lives beforehand, friendless lives. And I remember the one woman I mentioned in my article, and another person that's on my mind now, and I dare not say, but the idea that a person has this tremendous life-threatening illness, and it looks like 2 months from now I'm going to be dead. And yet they say, after you talk to them, you work with them, and they begin to see life in a whole new way. And in that space of time, that 60 days, from the onset of their illness to this day, I've had it happen so many times. They say, "I have lived more in these last 2 months than I have lived in my whole life." And I heard that statement 3 times from people profoundly seriously ill who have been through a process, that process of the 5 stages that's on that chart. And they've gone through it. They haven't lived before. They were afraid of life. They made choices based on being very careful, choices based on perhaps on accumulating some money or just another status position, but not that that's bad, but that the moves didn't enhance their life. They didn't enjoy making the moves. And here, when they're about to get this disease that says you only have maybe X number of months to live, that they suddenly, going through a process with somebody, they find that life is full and rich, and it can be so full that if even 60 days can be like a century. And I wish to God that I could get into that experience, because it's wonderful to watch somebody's face turn on like that. That woman I wrote about in the article was a viraggio. She was horrible. I was called in on the situation simply because they called a chaplain, because they wanted somebody to keep her busy and off the back of the staff until they could find a nursing home. And let me tell you, when that woman came back, by the time she left and they finally found a nursing home, they were crying. When she finally died on the unit, when she got herself back into the unit again, the whole staff was really in tears at this.
This has been a woman who'd been literally at their throats.
Literally, I can't repeat what they used to say about her. They wished that woman would X, Y, and Z. I mean, They had many epithets for her. But after her getting in touch with that, and she said in that seminar with about 50 students in the room, she said, I wish I had known this 40 years ago, because in the last 2 months I have lived more than I've lived in the 80-some years of my life.
You're director of the Boston Center for Religion and Psychotherapy, and the sense I get is that you're trying to bring these two aspects together, and also that you're trying to view the person as a full individual, viewing both the medical, the biological, the spiritual, the emotional aspects of a person and how those are integrated. And you've been saying that cancer and the way in which we face stress are strongly related. And so when we come back on Genesis 2, we want to talk about just what are those links and how you deal with them in a therapeutic way. We'll be right back. They wanted to stay where they were. Dr. Imara is saying that there is a strong link between cancer and stress and the way in which we deal with ourselves emotionally. And Dr. Imara, how then, for a person in therapy, do you deal with somebody who comes to you and says that I feel like there is something in my illness, my cancer, whatever, that is not just physical, but is psychological, is emotional in nature? Maybe they don't say that to you, maybe you say that to them, but how do you help a person move through that pattern of dealing with themselves in a full way?
Well, first I really just want to say to clear the air, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a pastoral counselor and a minister and a trained psychotherapist. And so I encourage and insist, of course, that people have adequate and full medical treatment for all of their illnesses and all times. But it's well known that all the journals, psychological, psychiatric, and so on, and could document that most illnesses are helped with relaxation of the stress, if you can reduce the stress. And of course, just getting into the material behind the major stresses in one's life is just stress reducing, i.e. counseling is just stress reducing. But I found that around 1970, 72, Dr. Ross and I found that since we had very little time to spend with people, sometimes doing a seminar or workshop, we had very little time. And what was the most we could do? From the feedback we got, some of the most helpful things we did was help people to fully relax. First, relax. And when you get people in full relaxation, we find that they're available then for supportive suggestion, for review of their own lifestyle, their current lifestyle, and so on. They're much more available. And that here recently there are more people working in it. A man in Fort Worth, Texas, a radiologist called Symington, who has found that meditation and concentration and relaxation have played some role in actually reversing cancer. So this is one of the things that I do for most people who have any kind of illness, is to help relax them, get into some kind of relaxation form or meditation.
This is another thing that comes maybe out of the blue, in the sense that Dr. Ross has been noted by people, and I saw it in an introduction to a book that a fellow I know wrote, whose wife died. And Dr. Ross wrote the introduction to that book, and she said, I wish I could have met your wife and talked with her during her stages of dying, because I would have liked to have shared with her what I found so many people who have died clinically and come back have said, that it was a beautiful experience, that death was a beautiful experience. Is there anything in terms of your counseling with people at that point of affirming life beyond this that can be comforting and supportive to people as they pass through that stage?
Well, I share with people quite often now, if they want to. I let it come up naturally. I don't force it. But prior to 1964, I was an adamant believer in the wall theory. You're here, and baby, when it's over, and that's it. And it took a couple of experiences, one of which was a person who had been clinically dead coming back. But it took a couple of these experiences, and finally, I began to waver, and I very firmly believe now, I firmly believe it's the wrong word. I believe, I am certain in my own awareness is coming to me from just what I've seen and experienced with people, that there is a life after death. And that's strange for a Unitarian minister to say.
On that note, let me thank you for joining us on Genesis 2. Our guest this morning, Dr. Mwalimu Imara, who is director of the Boston Center for Religion and Psychotherapy. Thanks for being with us. I'm Bill Turpie. We hope you'll join us again next week.